Most people think influence comes from being firm in conversations, but what actually weakens influence often appears like confidence. So the big question is, how can we maintain influence while making our point? If you're new here, hi, I'm Tiffany, and this is a part of the Lead Yourself series, trying to build a framework to help us make better decisions in work and relationships without overreacting, disappearing, or losing influence. I'm sharing what I've learned along the way so you won't waste time and energy on the same mistakes that end up costing more than they should. A few years ago, when I was managing a gym, there was a member on my team who often struggled with punctuality. He was talented and the members liked him, but he had this habit of arriving a few minutes late to his classes. At first, it didn't seem like a big deal, but over time, the schedule starts slipping. Other coaches noticed and members started asking questions. Eventually, it became something that needed to be addressed. So one afternoon, I asked him to come into my office to talk about it. If you've ever been in conversations like this, then you know that usually there's this invisible tension in the room. He knew why he was there, and I knew that this might turn into a defensive conversation. And both of us were quietly preparing for this possibility. Long story short, he started to explain why he had been late. You know, like the usuals. Traffic, the weather, a couple of difficult mornings. None of the reasons were completely unreasonable, but still, the situation needed to change. And this is where many conversations go wrong. A lot of people think influence in moments like this comes from confidence. They believe the way to handle it is to sound firm, speak loudly, and push to a point where the other person understands the seriousness of this issue. But something interesting happens when we push way too hard or when we don't slow down enough. At some point, the person who was supposed to listen usually stops listening, not because they don't understand the seriousness of the issue, but because the emotional temperature in the room rises. You see, when tension rises, people subconsciously shift into self-protection mode. So instead of processing the information, they begin defending themselves because they feel attacked. With that being said, the conversation turns into a competition instead of a solution. No one wants to solve the problem because we're all too busy trying to win. What I've noticed over the years is that influence rarely comes from force. It comes from emotional steadiness and clarity. People don't usually follow the loudest person in the room. They tend to follow the person who feels the most stable. Back to that conversation. Instead of pushing harder, I slowed things down. I listened to what he had to say, and I acknowledged that some mornings are indeed unpredictable. After that, I calmly returned to the point. I told him the classes still start at the same time. Members are waiting and the team is adjusting around his schedule. Instead of raising my voice, I painted this picture for him. Because if the emotional temperature stays low, the brain can actually process what's being said. The conversation stops being about defending ego and returns to solving the problem. And honestly, you'd be surprised how often these patterns show up. In disagreements, in meetings, and even in relationships. When emotions start rising, many people try to increase their force. Talk faster, argue harder, and try to win the moment. But that usually backfires. When somebody stays emotionally steady, their signals are easier to trust. That's how influence works. The brain reads calm behavior as safety. And when people feel safe enough, they can actually consider what's being said. Clarity travels better through stability than through force. But to be clear, this doesn't mean avoiding difficult conversations or pretend that problems don't exist. Sometimes directness is necessary. Sometimes boundaries need to be clear. Point is how you deliver it. Force creates resistance. Stability creates space for understanding. It's natural for people to move towards comfort and away from stress. And when things get messy or uncertain, the attention naturally shifts towards the most stable person in the room. Not because they demand authority, but because their presence feels reliable. For this episode, I created a small tool called the stability check. It helps identify moments when influence is slipping. Not because the message is wrong, but because the emotional signals in the conversation have become unstable. If you want to practice recognizing that shift, the tool can be useful. Check it down below. Anyway, influence isn't about confidence. It's about bringing emotional steadiness and clarity into the room. In this episode, we talked about how pushing too hard can weaken your influence. But in the next episode, we'll talk about a completely different pattern, which is when we try to explain too much. Over-explaining often sounds like clarity, but underneath, it's actually seeking approval. And the more we do it, the more our position starts to weaken. We'll look at the difference between explaining and leading. Why does one ask for permission while the other sets direction? Anyway, I'll see you in the next episode. Bye!